Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. China's been in the news, I don't know, for as long as I've been following politics. I remember seeing a book a couple decades ago about the coming war with China. I've always been skeptical of that idea. I think we're too mutually dependent on one another. But nevertheless, I thought it would be good to have somebody on who could talk intelligently about China, its history, and its goals for the future. And we're lucky to have with us today a William Claude Reavis Professor in the Department of Political Science and Senior Advisor to the President and Provost of Global Initiatives at the University of Chicago. He also has a new book out called Wuhan, How the COVID-19 Outbreak Spiraled Out of Control. Professor Dali L, welcome to the program.
Good morning.
I want to start a little bit before what might be called modern China. What were the political and cultural environments like in China prior to the communist revolution?
Well, clearly, as we recall, in fact, I was just listening to a biography of President Truman. And in fact, the 1950s is a favorite time of mine. As we look back in terms of thinking about globally, not just China, but clearly China at that point went through a lot of turmoil. For example, the Japanese invasion into China, which really significantly, not only did the ruling, the nationalist government lose a lot of territory. When you think about it, they lost a lot of the tax revenue. And of course, in the process, it created space for the communist revolution. The communist armies were much more disciplined, and they had a single mission, really, to capture power under the aegis of Marxism, Leninism, but most importantly, at that point, is nationalism. And of course, the U.S. With General Marshall tried to mediate at one point, didn't succeed. There was civil war, actually, basically between the time of 1945 and 1949, in particular through the end of the year, and in fact, going into 1950 as well, a little bit. So it's in this process, really, China went into the Second World War, the Pacific War, long before it started in other parts of Asia, then continues to be in war and revolution following the conclusion of the Second World War. So we are talking about truly a generational time. And of course, it's in this context that the communists under Mao captured power. And of course, he had a lot of support. He also actually, incidentally, espoused at that point, really made use of the rhetoric of liberty and democracy. He actually played to the American sentiments at that point as well, would send messages to congratulate the US on Independence Day and so on as well. So he played it in a way in capturing the popular imagination, in capturing international support to some extent, and of course in capturing power internally within China.
Okay, now to back up just a little bit, what was the May 4th movement?
Well, that actually happened following, especially at the end of the First World War. China, the government of China actually did eventually join in the First World War, and there were many liberals who went to Europe as well. At the end of the First World War, if many listeners would recall or try to remember, President Wilson espoused and supported national independence. China had territories captured, for example, by Germany at one point. It happens to be very close to my hometown in Shandong. And there was discussion about China wanted that territory back, actually. And however, through a process of negotiation, that territory was given to Japan, actually. So and of course, you can imagine at that point, there was a weakening of national identity in China, and the young people, and including people, and actually, there are just many people, especially college students in Beijing, went on protest, actually to protect protest that decision to transfer that territory to Japan. But most importantly, the Mid-Force movement is not only actually involving youth and nationalism, but also this process of promoting and especially emphasizing the importance of science and democracy for rejuvenating the nation in China as well. So the nationalist government now, of course, later on, it lost the territory on the mainland and went to Taiwan. But nonetheless, that spirit they continued wanted to carry on. And likewise, the communists on the mainland later on also at various times emphasized that we are the inheritors of the Mid-Force movement as well. So it's a it's not a big movement per se in terms of numbers, given the size and scale of China. However, in terms of history, in terms of the way that we think about China, and for historians to think about China, is an extraordinarily important moment that's being played and emphasized in Chinese history.
Would it be accurate to say that in comparison with traditional Marxism or Soviet Marxism, that Chinese communism was laced with elements of nationalism?
Yes, but it took time. Initially, the Communist Party actually, in around the time of, let's say, 1920 and 1921, it was founded, but with support from the Soviets, from the Comintern, the Communist International. And there was funding, there was advising from the Comintern. However, I do also want to emphasize the nationalist government in China also sought, the nationalist leaders also sought support from the Soviet Union as well. So both sides went and, in fact, emulated some of the practices, including Leninist organizational principles in organizing the party and so on. And for many years afterward, in the 1920s and 30s, the Chinese Communist Party was really getting a lot of instructions and advice from the Soviets and so on. But over time, however, as the Communist Party and its troops got actually punched by the nationalists, that created room for Mao to rise through the Long March and so on. And in the process, Mao never went abroad by that point, didn't study in Europe or work in Europe. And he was much more indigenous, and he also was much more clearly in tune with what's happening in China. And in the process, of course, he continued to pay attention to the Soviet Union and so on. But over time, however, there was this process of reorganization, recombination, and of course, the Communist Party of China became much more indigenized. However, even then, remember, in fact, as the communists came to power officially assumed national power in 1949, the first country that recognized the People's Republic of China was the Soviet Union. And of course, Mao went on a long trip to visit the USSR. And of course, they had a treaty with the USSR. And also, of course, he, at that point, revered Stalin, even though in private he was grumbling because he wasn't being paid as much attention as he thought he deserved or wanted, clearly. And of course, over time, however, this process was all of those actually have contributed eventually to the Sino-Soviet split as well.
Now, as most of my audience, probably the vast majority, would look at communists as the bad guys, as do I. But as is often the case in these types of civil wars, it's not as if the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek were promoters of liberty or classical liberal values, right? What were they for? I mean, I know they were nationalists, but policy-wise, what were some of the things that the Chiang Kai-shek government was in favor of?
Well, following the end of the Second World War with the defeat of Japan, for Chiang Kai-shek as the national leader, of course, it's a moment of great national pride. And of course, the ROC, the Republic of China, was one of the founding members of the United Nations and contributed to ideas such as human rights as well. And so it was a moment of national reconstruction and so on. The challenge, however, is with the Civil War over time, there was a lot of mismanagement. There was corruption, clearly, also. And of course, there was what became by 1947, in particular, a process of galloping inflation. Inflation, well, we all went through a bout of inflation last year of 7-8%. But imagine you get an inflation rate of 7,000, 10,000% in 1 year or something of that nature. That alone contributed dramatically to the loss of popular support. And of course, gave the room for the opponent, the opposition in this case, especially the communists, to say, well, look at how everything is going badly, actually. So there was clearly a lot of problems in terms of the nationalists, in terms of this organization, in terms of this discipline, in terms of this management of the economy, and of course, in the process, it had better equipped troops and so on. But of course, in the social political environment, it's very hard to hold. And of course, Jiang and the nationalist troops were defeated on the mainland. Of course, it went through reforms after a lot of the leaders and the troops retreated to Taiwan. There was a moment really of seeking redemption through, of course, carrying out reforms and so on. And eventually, of course, as we know, Taiwan has actually, over time, in defeat, it actually made more progress in many ways, but it took a long time.
What do you think we need to know about Chairman Mao in terms of who influenced him, how he governed, and what has been his lasting impact on China?
Well, of course, Mao is an extraordinarily complex personality. He was, in many ways, of course, China was going through this process from the Qing dynasty lasting through 1911 with the civil service exams and so on. But that empire got destroyed. That civil service exam got actually sort of abandoned. And so the rise in the aspiring elites, or people who have a lot of energies, were seeking opportunities. Mao and others, they were born in the late Qing period, but they grew up in this period of turmoil, a lot of internal turmoil, and they wanted national unification, or certainly wanted to thrive. And of course, he was very driven to power as well. But one should not deny also that there were people who wanted to see China become better and so on. And it's in this process, he actually read a lot in Chinese classics. He was taking in, experimenting with all sorts of ideas at one point. But of course, eventually he decides he leans to Marxism, Leninism. But in fact, he didn't have a lot of patience for that as well, and which showed later on. But he read a lot of Chinese classics about issues of power, of war laws, and so on in Chinese history. And of course, it showed in the way that he governed. But of course, in the beginning, when after the communists came to national power, let's say around 1949, 1950, they leaned towards the Soviet Union. They really wanted to learn from the Soviet Union. Mao also expected that that would produce almost like a miracle or something like that. So China went on the way of the first 5-year plan and so on, and had a lot of Soviet advisors The Soviet Union was in a period of leadership transition as well, from Stalin to Khrushchev. And in the process, the PRC got a lot of support. But very soon, however, what's truly interesting about China under Mao was he became very unhappy, dissatisfied with this new system, because planning required a lot of regimentation. And you needed, in the Soviet Union, for example, there were just many ministries working together to produce the numbers for running the economy. Imagine Mao going from decades fighting wars to regimented planning. And he was just not very happy. But most importantly, he's not someone who's happy with a lot of numbers and so on. So going to a system of central planning and numbers meant ceding control to people who are good with that. And Mao actually sort of felt that very frustrated with it. In this process, however, the Soviet Union, by especially 1957, 58, remember in the Cold War, there was the Sputnik moment. And in fact, it's in that moment, Mao also got quite carried away and thinking and talking about how the East was rising and the West was declining. The Soviet socialist camp or bloc was really gaining ascendance. So in this process, he wanted, remember, he was mobilizing people, running wars and so on. Now he decided to mobilize the people to develop China. And that became the Great Leap Forward in 1958, lasting all the way, of course, rushing the rural population into people's communes and regimenting them, but actually mobilizing the people to develop. It really played to Mao's strength in terms of national mobilization. He was constantly traveling around the country on a special train. He actually was spending a lot of time, not in Beijing, but actually around the country, talking to provincial leaders. It really gave him the feeling of, again, in command and energized and so on. It also got China into trouble. And there was a lot of waste, a lot of exhausted liberals, a lot of problems with steel making in the backyard, and of course, neglecting the farmland and so on. So by 1960, China was caught in the worst famine in human history. Just by looking at official numbers alone from China, for 1950, the Chinese population, which had been growing very rapidly, the net population growth in China for 1960 was negative 10 million. In other words, even by official numbers from the People's Republic of China in 1960, the Chinese population not only didn't grow, it should have been growing, but it didn't grow. It actually declined by 10 million people. In other words, a lot of people starved to death. It became really the worst famine in human history. But it also, I actually wrote a book called Calamity and Reform in China. Of course, it also persuaded a lot of people, very painful way, clearly, the survivors, that the people's communes were not working, right? And also the way to make a lot of steel in backyard furnaces wasn't very good either. So it actually disabused a lot of people of the extreme excesses of the Maoist way of pursuing economic development. Mao, incidentally, in this process, also lost interest, well, because it wasn't working for him. So he turned eventually, after the economy recovered, he turned to the ideological, the superstructure, so to speak, and eventually launched the Cultural Revolution against a lot of those people who actually were not happy with him during the relief, especially. And of course, that meant the late Mao, from especially the Great Leap Forward through the Cultural Revolution until Mao died in 1976, Mao, on the one hand, led the communists to power, but also launched one campaign after another, but especially with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, did a lot to undermine the edifice towards central planning and so on. And in the process, also split with the Soviet Union. So he really, in this process, put China into, in a way, making China by 1969 the enemy of the Soviet Union, Japan, and the United States, and of course, capitalism and so on overall. So he maneuvered into a dead end. But in this process, however, he also began to see that he needed to do something. And he began to think, oh, maybe we can approach the United States, actually. And at the same time, the Nixon administration, as it came to power, won the election, began to look, and of course, President Nixon had, as a candidate, talked about the need to get the Chinese people out of that angry isolation. And so it's in this process, and with some help from the Pakistanis, and of course, with Kissinger getting heavily involved in the process. And Charles de Gaulle was actually the one who suggested to Kissinger that the US should do something with regard to China. The US and China, of course, there was the ping pong diplomacy, and by February 21st, 1972, President Nixon was able to make the trip to Beijing. So in other words, Mao swerved from one end of the spectrum politically, internationally, from the Soviet Union, all the way towards the right, and receiving President Nixon, and eventually laying the ground for almost like a quasi-alliance with the United States against the Soviet imperialism. And of course, as China, after Mao died, launched on the way of reform and opening, it became much more successful economically. And of course, that put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. So China went in the 1950s, was a staunch ally of the Soviet Union, but towards the end of the Cold War, contributed very significantly to undermining the Soviet Union, and of course contributing to its breakup as well.
A couple questions I have. First, you mentioned the peasant communes in the Great Leap Forward. Mao, from my understanding, in his younger years, had a disdain for peasants. He didn't like them, but wasn't a fan. What caused him to begin to appeal to them? Was it simply that the way it was going wasn't working? Was it real sympathy? What was going on?
Well, Mao grew up in a farming family. His father had land, but he ran away, and he wanted to make things happen, and he didn't want to work the farm. There's no doubt about it, that actually. It's sort of but at the same time, the Chinese population was predominantly agrarian. They are, of course, and this is again a paradox about the Chinese Revolution, because according to orthodox Marxism, you need the working class to make revolution. But China had a very tiny working class. So the Chinese communism, therefore, the communist movement has to make hay out of what it had. And in this case, it's essentially the population that they could reach to, namely the peasants in particular. But of course, still they wanted to develop industry. So in the 1950s, during the part of the reason for the Great Leap Forward actually was to get the farmers to organize into communes so that they could become more efficient in production, so that there would be more surplus from the countryside that could be extracted for developing industry, to invest in machinery, weaponry, and so on. So it's still the goal, but it's an intermediate stage in a way. But it's also, of course, China was emulating the Soviet Union to some extent, because in the Soviet Union, there was the kolkhoz and so on. But it did rest on certain premises or aspirations, and in the sense that they thought, by having all those farmers organized into larger collectives, and for example, even by having the kids being taken care of together, by having them eating in cafeteria rather than eating alone, you would economize, you would become more efficient, and of course, there would be more production. It didn't work that way. People really, of course, that also meant equalization. The most productive laborers actually were not getting paid more. Their incentives were destroyed in the process. They lost their farm animals and implements, and they were not very happy. And at the same time, in a collective, there would be a lot of shirking, all those kind of opportunism, and of course, morale was destroyed, and so on in the process. But Mao thought he really, I mean, in promoting larger and larger collectives in the countryside, he really believed that by having all those people working together, that there would be better productivity. And it clearly showed he didn't see farmers as his friends. He saw the farmers actually as tools for realizing his dream, the political dream of getting more surpluses out of the countryside. And of course, it also showed that he may have come from the farm, how actually he really wasn't working for the interests of the farmers, although he would profess that he was. But in fact, he really destroyed them. And of course, the famine was such a dreadful event.
Speaking of the famine, it reminds me of the famines that took place in the Soviet Union, where peasants were dying also. Are the two similar in terms of what caused them, or is it just a giant coincidence that the two largest communist countries both suffered famines?
Well, in both cases, clearly they were both designed to get more surpluses or more grains out of the countryside and other supplies. And incidentally, we do want to mention in the Soviet Union, the famine happened in the Ukraine, actually, and the attack, especially really the rich peasants and so on. So there was actually a very in the Soviet Union, in the case of the Soviet Union, with that famine, so sort of there was almost like a effort to crack down on the people who had the grain and so on. But it was much more targeted towards a certain population. In the Chinese case, however, it's the majority of the rural population that became the victims of this process. So it's in terms of the popular base, there are distinctions. But overall, however, you're absolutely right. Communist regimes have gone through these processes. And it's not just the USSR, China, the PRC, but various other communist regimes as well.
Okay, you mentioned the Cultural Revolution. I've heard about it my whole life, I think, but I really have never known what exactly it consisted of. So can you tell us what was the Cultural Revolution?
Well, let me be honest with you. There are many different opinions, even within China, about what it was. Clearly, there was a power element. The power element was that Mao felt after the Great Leap famine that he had lost influence. In theory, he actually went into the second front, not in the front line. So he delegated a lot of the responsibilities to his colleagues, in particular, for example, Liu Shaoqi and Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping and so on. So he wanted to get some of that influence and power back. So there is that element. But there was also other elements, and Mao clearly touched the chord in saying that there was so much more bureaucracy. Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, those people, they are not stirring up people for mobilization and so on. They wanted better organization, more incentives, but also that meant more hierarchy and so on. And in the process, of course, there were also grievances. Different strata of the population were benefiting from some of the policies and so on. So Mao later on made the argument that Liu and Deng Xiaoping in particular, they were labeled capitalist roaders. In other words, they were leading China onto the road of capitalism. And of course, Liu actually died really without well, essentially like in custody or something of that nature. But at the same time, throughout the Chinese bureaucracy, whether it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and many other places, even the embassy in London, the Red Guards rose in rebellion against the powers that be in China. So throughout the country in China, there was actually sort of a lot of popular, essentially uprising against the leaders in the provinces, in the cities, in the communes, in the factories, and so on. So, which is why the Cultural Revolution also captured the imagination of many people around the world. And of course, it tied in with, I remember at that point, there was, especially in the late 1960s, there was the Vietnam War and a lot of the protests as well. But in the Chinese case, however, you look at the schools were suspended, students were not having classes, obviously, and the Red Guards rose in rebellion. They killed off some of the teachers, some of the principals as well. So it was a very destructive moment, clearly. But it depends on whose stand you take, actually. And of course, it's definitely not a cultural, well, a lot of the cultural artifacts throughout the country were also destroyed. So depending, clearly there was a lot of destruction and so on as well. And of course, then over time, remember, factories were not producing as well. The students were not in class, and there were a lot of youths roaming around the country and doing linking up. Eventually, however, many of them, more than 10 million, were sent to the countryside, up to the mountains, down to the countryside. The argument is they needed to be educated by the workers and peasants. And for many of them, they won't be able to return to the cities for many years, and some of them forever, actually. But in reality, part of the reason the Chinese leaders wanted them to be sent away is because they were creating chaos, because they had no job, they were not in school. Imagine what a 18-year-old would be doing, and they had no computer games to play either.
Yeah. Mao died, I think, in September of 76, a month or so after I was born. At some point after that, they implement these reforms in China called the Four Modernizations. What were they, and what were their significance?
Well, actually, even before Mao died, at the National People's Congress that finally reconvened, then the premier Zhou Enlai began to articulate, of course, again with Mao's approval, that China should seek the four modernizations. In other words, modernizations in agriculture, industry, and national defense, and so on. So sort of, and of course, following Mao's death, the new leadership under Hua Guofeng, a leader who's been mostly relegated to the sidelines very soon, but most importantly, from many people's memories, actually declared that the Cultural Revolution had concluded. China should actually reorient itself towards economic development. By 1978, actually, so sort of Deng Xiaoping was allowed to be back. Liu Shaoqi had died during the Cultural Revolution. Lin Biao had died during the Cultural Revolution. And also, Zhou Enlai died in 1976. So we had a new leadership, and Deng rises over time. And around that time, I mean, the Cultural Revolution was a decade when China focused on domestic political struggles rather than growing the economy. In the meantime, the neighboring economies in particular were growing rapidly. Japan, South Korea, and of course there is the nemesis, the Republic of China, namely Taiwan in particular, and Singapore. And the newer leaders realized that China was lagging behind and decided, and they actually they traveled, they saw how the rest of the world had moved on. And Deng in particular felt keenly as he rose, he really decided to launch, basically to make economic development the top priority for China to catch up.
So while the economy, I guess, can be seen as being liberalized, I mean, they could call it communism with Chinese characteristics, but it's more liberal, more capitalistic. The Chinese government is still seen as very heavy-handed, not big respecters of civil liberties. What is life like for your average Chinese citizen in terms of civil liberties, in terms of their ability to move about, communicate, access the internet, form friendships, marriages, et cetera, et cetera? How are they living?
Well, when we compare China today with the Mao era, it's day and night, practically. Remember the rural population, and that's the majority of the population, they were called in the communes. The system of communes were more or less maintained. So people were not able to travel. You cannot travel without green coupons and permissions, actually, so in China at that point. And with Mao's death, China very quickly, by the early 1980s, decollectivized the countryside. And of course, what I argue is, of course, part of the reason and the irony of history was that Mao had, through the relief and the famine, made sure that people really didn't like some of those institutions. But of course, the push towards decollectivization was given a big push by Deng Xiaoping and others who were willing to simply want to abandon the commune system. Actually, so as a result, the number one thing in the post-Mao era was really the liberation of the rural population from the commune system. They got land contracted to them. They don't own the land anymore, like in 1950. However, they contracted the land for initially for a few years, but eventually became 15 to 30 years and so on, right? And at the same time, they can plant, they can sell on their own, they can travel. And very soon, as factories began to be set up and so on, as the investors from Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan came to China and the US later on, so many of the farmers, the rural population were moving to the cities, joining the factories, and producing for the global market. At one point, Walmart alone was importing, accounting for 10% of the US imports from China and so on. So as a result, suddenly China had more opportunities, both on the land and off the land, and joining the globalization. And China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001 as well. And of course, the Chinese economy really moved up much more rapidly in the process. But of course, it's also the moment gradually that the internet was introduced into China as well. So the population gradually gained access to the internet. So today there is censorship, but actually almost everybody has virtually a smartphone, or the majority of the population. They can communicate. The village is magnified as a result, just like the world overall. But of course, when you have gossip, the gossip can be good and bad, right? So and that's the case in China as well. People can travel, and China has developed this tremendous national systems of highways and high-speed railways. People can own cars, and so a lot of young people in particular have been traveling. And during the lockdown period, there were some people who just drove away and into outlying areas in China to travel around and so on. And they can carry the internet with them now. So as a result, actually, we do see a generation. In the meantime, in the 1960s, China introduced the very draconian population control policies. the so-called one-child policy. It's not exactly one child, but it's predominantly just one child per couple in the urban areas in particular. But that also meant you had a generation, 2 generations now of children who were pretty pampered, actually, who were given a lot of opportunities, who saw only growing prosperity over the last 40 years, and who had much greater aspirations in the meantime. And that's actually the China that we have. And of course, that also means that they are much more confident in conducting and handling themselves. And here is the little irony. They don't want to work on the farm. They don't even want to work in the factories anymore because that's so regimented.
How are dissidents treated? I mean, if you criticize the government in China, is it okay? Do they just let you get away with it? Do they lock them up, threaten them? What happens?
Clearly, no. In this, so sort of part of the reason is so the Communist Party came to power, captured power through military means in the 1940s, and of course, it has been very intent on maintaining its power. It wanted the economy to grow, wanted China to be strong, but also wanted to stay in control. And that's, for the Communist Party, that's the bottom line at this point as well. And that also meant that as China, the society has diversified, the economy has grown, the Communist Party has also been working very hard to strengthen its own organizational capabilities and so on to maintain control. So China, of course, as a result, has established very elaborate stability maintenance system. And it actually has been installing surveillance in schools and in public spaces as well. It does not want to have repeats of the Tiananmen protests of 1989. And of course, most of the Chinese population have learned to work within the parameters. They grumble, they complain, but they also know that if you are openly against the Communist Party, you'll end up on the wrong side and can get into big trouble. Some, of course, have escaped abroad and claim political asylum, but overall, that's the situation. So there is a lot of information available. People clearly in private and so on have their own opinions, but the Communist Party is also extremely determined, and under Xi Jinping as the general secretary, very strongly oriented towards maintaining the leadership of the Communist Party and maintaining his leadership as well.
Many people view China as a serious threat to the national security of the United States. I'm very skeptical of the idea. I mean, I have no idea that no doubt that China spies on America, like I have no doubt that America spies on China. But you have people that believe, for instance, that COVID-19 was a bioweapon created by the Chinese government. You have people that think that, a lot of people, even I guess in our own government, that think that TikTok is a means by which China can spy on America. Is China a serious military threat to America? And do you think there's any truth to the bioweaponer idea or the TikTok idea?
Those are a lot of the hot button issues of the day, clearly. Well, of course, those are, there are many books that have been written about China's foreign policy and military policy and so on. I mean, globally, clearly, China has come an extraordinarily long way to the extent that, of course, it's building aircraft carriers, is reorganizing the military, incidentally learning from emulating the US. And the irony is, of course, we don't like it as the China actually becomes stronger in this way. Of course, we do have, the two countries have very significant differences on certain issues. The biggest issue actually happens to be about Taiwan. But overall, as a result, very often the two countries are at loggerheads, but at the same time, I think actually, especially in the last year or so, there is keener recognition on the part of the leadership of both countries that conflict and direct confrontation of the two countries are just too costly. And especially those are two countries with nuclear powers, nuclear weapons, actually. So I think actually what we do see are some echoes from the Cold War era of seeking to contain conflict. And there's no doubt there is competition, that the two countries are not seeing eye to eye on various issues. But at the same time, the leaders are trying to manage and to some extent injecting some sense of responsibility in managing the relationship. But there is clearly, and as President Biden just announced, also stated, actually, it's a very competitive relationship in various ways, actually. And a lot of this is driven by the fact that China, for the last 40 years, has benefited from the access to the US market, has been running truly an astronomical trade surplus against the US. And of course, the US over time recognized that surplus is being turned into not only economic power, but also, of course, economic power translates into influence, into military power as well. And of course, as a result, during the Trump and Biden administrations, there has been a much greater effort to try to be more disciplined in reducing the trade deficit and so on in recent years. And it is in this context, and as we can see, there are Chinese companies that have become very, very influential over time, and TikTok is just one. And ironically, the parent company of TikTok is called ByteDance. It purchased a small app called Musical.ly many years ago, and it turned it into one of the most popular apps globally, but especially in the US as TikTok. In China, TikTok is not available. A sister app is available. It's called Douyin. Actually, so sort of, and of course, there is this challenge potentially because the worry is that apps like this actually have to be subjected to the regulation by the Communist Party potentially in China, and therefore there is the potential for influence. And I think actually TikTok played itself into the hands of the criticisms because it launched its users to call a congressman and so on in the last few days. So it actually showed the capability of it to mobilize and so on. But the irony is, in China, it will be seen in the same way. And you would wonder, actually, if the Communist Party leadership sees TikTok being mobilized against the to actually support certain policies. So the Chinese regulators would be looking at this, in their own light as well. Now, with regard to COVID-19, and of course, as you have mentioned, I have just published this book on Wuhan. I think actually over time, of course, there are suspicions. There were, especially in the days when information wasn't easily available, there are people who are arguing and spreading rumors, saying that actually this is a bioengineered weapon or something like that. The Chinese side, there are people in China who actually claim that it came from a US lab. And of course, there is intense debate about those kind of issues. I think actually we have seen how this virus mutates so rapidly over time. And if it were bioengineered, presumably it would have been tested and much more stable or something of that nature, right? So I think actually today there's the people who are knowledgeable, there is hardly anyone who is arguing that it's a bioengineered weapon. But of course, there is a lot of debate about still where it came from. And of course, it's because originally the Chinese experts thought it came from the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan, actually. And later on, they didn't have specific evidence confirming that's the case. In fact, part of the reason was also because by the time the China CDC started to collect samples, it's been many days since the outbreak had already happened. So a lot of the samples, the RNA, the virus had degraded and so on. They also didn't collect animal specimens initially. But of course, the publications from the China CDC itself does not even claim today that it came from that particular market. So it's an open question, actually, continuing subject to debate, and including today, actually. And I think many scientists are involved in search of the origins, and there are competing hypotheses at this point.
Okay, Professor Yang, is there anything we didn't cover that you think is important for us to cover?
Yeah, certainly in terms of the Wuhan book, which I certainly hope many of your listeners would be interested, because it actually teases out and helps us understand how did the virus spread in a way. And my argument centrally is that actually Chinese experts and the Chinese health emergency response system had very good information at the end of the December 2019. They knew that the symptoms were SARS-like. They had multiple genomic sequences. And in fact, there was an action program that was launched that included the shuttering of the Huanan seafood market. But it just showed how the Chinese system works in a way, because we tend to think everything is controlled centrally, that President Xi, as General Secretary, would command everything. It's far from the truth, actually. And in fact, there are the Chinese CDC system, for example, is highly fragmented. Every city has a CDC, every province has a CDC, every district has a CDC. But those CDCs do not directly report to the China CDC. They report to the local governments. They were subjected to influence by the local authorities. And in the process, the information was bottled up in the localities. So they took emergency action on January 1st. And then as the information dwindled, the experts, the leaders in Beijing, wasn't getting the information about new cases because of certain errors in the system. And they thought by January 10th, they were publicly saying that the outbreak was limited, in other words, under control. They thought they had already contained, essentially, they were on the way to containing the outbreak in Wuhan. And they couldn't be more wrong. So my book really is to help us understand how the Chinese system works and how could they have made such a grievous error so that the virus spread unimpeded, and of course at tremendous cost to, of course, not only within China, but globally. And this is why the subtitle, how the outbreak actually spiraled out of control. So it's only on January 20th, finally, actually following alerts from elsewhere outside of Wuhan, that the Chinese leadership realized that the situation was getting serious, and they did another expedition to Wuhan and realized the outbreak actually was spreading rapidly. And they actually, on January 23rd, 2020, they locked the city of 10 million people, more than 10 million people, locked down Wuhan. And of course, the rest is history, as we know, actually.
Okay, thank you very much for being here and enlightening us on the subject of China. It's a very important topic. Where can people find you, and where can they find your book?
Well, certainly they can find the book whenever books are sold. I think today, and for many people, that's online. But of course, I strongly encourage readers to also patronize their local stores if they can. The title is Wuhan. The subtitle is How the COVID-19 Outbreak Spiraled in China, Spiraled out of control. Yeah, I'm Dali L, and I can easily be looked up online.
Okay, thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me. It's truly a great pleasure.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, give me your likes, give me your shares, give me your subscribes. They all help. Till next time.